Hello and welcome to episode 49 of The Garden Log. I am Ben Dark and I am a gardener, and thank goodness I am back in the garden. It has been too long. I've been indulging myself and lying supine, and now I am back, erect and afoot, and snipping things and gardening, and I can tell you all about it in this week's podcast. There is some talk of hellebores. There's some talk of tender geraniums. There is also some firm fern advice. I'm discussing the gardens of Queen Anne for a little bit and talking about one of history's drunken gardeners. Goodness knows there have been many of them. So if that sounds enticing enough, then come with me as we enter the week in gardening. Welcome to the week in gardening. My goodness, it was good to be back on Monday morning. I'd spent the Christmas period of hibernation eating and reading books, as I'm sure most of you did. And it's good, it's wonderful to spend so much time immersed in literature and awful films and family in-jokes and all of the other things that one does over Christmas. But there's still activities that are active in a way, and gardening, I've realised, is my least active time, and therefore almost my most productive time. It's a period of purposeless thought for me when I'm out in the garden. The mind wanders more readily when you're doing something for 8 hours, something physical and unthinking, and you can go into all sorts of interesting imaginative places, which you can't even really do when you're reading a book. Monday was spent under a fairly thick blanket of cloud, much like the preceding 3 weeks. Actually, we haven't seen much of the great glowing orb. I don't know if someone out there has offended the sun god, or maybe actually they haven't. Maybe someone has just particularly pleased the cloud gods. I think that we're all destined for rickets if this carries on much longer. I didn't let it dull my mood though, because it was just so fantastic to be out and gardening, and for such a stretch as well. I'd spent quite a bit of time outside, but that time had been spent mainly just actively recovering from meals, stomping around with dogs, trying to burn off just a few calories so that I could fit in the next tranche of calories. And so to be outside with the secateurs doing that strange gardening yoga, that strange Tai Chi stuff that you do, particularly at this time of year, because the flower beds are still kind of wet, so you don't really want to stand on any of them at all. So you end up doing these wonderful stretched poses with one foot on a stepping stone and the other foot on a plank of wood that you've managed to position between two clumps of emerging bulbs, and then you're bending sideways and down to the left and snipping off a leaf that's behind your Achilles tendon, and all these wonderful poses that people no doubt pay good money to be taught. Most of my horticultural Tai Chi this week was in the service of the hellebore, or the hellebore rather, the hellebore cutback. And I was taking off last season's leaves, those big old leathery things, the dragon's wings, the things that had seen them through the season but were now battered and tough and thick. And the reason I was doing this was to show the wonderful emergent clumps of flower buds. I should say that these are the hellebore cross hybridus types, the hybrid hellebores, the ones that seed profusely and then come up in all of these weird pick-a-mix colours. I wouldn't do this to the species hellebores, the ones I was planting a few months ago, the Corsican hellebore or the fetid hellebore, because they tend to flower at the top of the plant in a different way. They're not hidden behind their own bushel. Anyway, the old leaves are snipped away, and then you get this beautiful, beautiful little clump of emerging hellebores. And even before the flowers fully open, they look wonderful. They look like some sort of tiny, perfect, pearlescent vegetable when they are first emerging, because it's a wonderfully big flower bud for this time of year. And I think the whitish yellowy cultivars, they look like little cauliflowers, all in their sheaths with the leaves around them. And then those more sort of burgundy wine-coloured ones, I think they look like tiny little aubergines almost. And it's almost incongruous to see as they grow up and bigger and then begin to flower properly, which some of them are doing even now, how flowery they are. They are big flowers, and this is the middle of winter. We're not talking a little winter flowering jasmine thing. These are proper full-on flowers, and it's very nice to see them. I've had a strange change of heart when it comes to hellebores and to cutting them back, because I don't know, it does feel odd that you're growing a plant that needs so much of the hand of the human to make it look at its best. You feel somehow that this is a plant overbred, that we can't appreciate the flowers until we've fiddled around with it and messed about with it. And sometimes I felt that devalues it in a way. But this year I'm very, very fond of them, and I'm enjoying this bit of sort of midwifery, this helping beauty be born. I think we have to give ourselves credit, the ingenuity of the plant breeders, for outdoing nature on many occasions. I was thinking of this quite a lot. Just before Christmas, I was doing an essay on the arts and crafts movement, and I was reading lots of John Ruskin to go back to the beginnings of that stuff and those ideas and thinkings. And he has that brilliant quote. I can't remember it exactly, so I'll paraphrase it. He's talking about geology, and he says something like, "If only those damned geologists would leave me alone. I hear the chiming of their hammers at the end of every Bible verse." And he's talking about the slow disapproval of the scriptures in the mid-19th century. And of course, most of our hybrid plants are also scriptural impossibilities. These are plants who did not exist in the Garden of Eden, and yet we have them here for ourselves. So that's nice, something to think about as you cut back the hellebores. And also think about all of the slugs that you will probably find. I think that this year that the hellebores have been acting as little slug dormitories. There's something about the upright stems of the old flowers. It tends to trap a lot of blown leaves amongst them. And then the slugs come in and they've got this wonderful blanket. And so I found all sorts of different things, probably 4 or 5 different species of slugs living in one little hellebore clump, which was quite exciting. Not for the slugs, I would venture. And so I cut back things, and then I had a period of worry, because obviously the day involved a little wander around the grounds, seeing what was doing what. And there are patches of lawn that have started to look ropey, and there's a bit of dye back on some of the plants. And we have to realise that there's a huge amount of winter left to go through. And even though growth is all around us, plants that are suffering now will continue to do so all the way through January and February. And so there are some areas where if you spotted a gap, say in a lawn or in the crown of a plant, it's only going to get worse. So I'm gonna try and remedy a few of those things. There's bits of the lawn particularly that are looking very ropey indeed. But at least the day was mild. I shouldn't complain at all. That's part of the fun of being a gardener. That's part of the challenge. It's coming against these little problems and solving them, or just chopping them out and pretending that they never happened. So anyway, that was Monday, and we moved seamlessly on into Tuesday, which was colder. It was a much more intentional weather. The day was definitely doing something with its climate it threw at us. It was cold and dry, and actually very cold. And we made ourselves colder by retreating into dark woods at the furthest stretch of the estate. in a place that is inconvenient to reach and to transport things to. And in this place, we were building a satellite compost heap. A compost heap for the things in this vicinity. It's actually technically a separate property, so it's quite hard to transport things back to the main heap, the main constantly cooking sort of volcano that we keep bubbling over there. So we're building a 4-bay woodland compost heap. And we did that all on Tuesday. It's the similar process. I'm sure you've got another blog to tell you how to dig holes and fill them with postcrete and stand your posts up with spirit levels and nail things onto the side. It's quite an exciting compost heap. I can't take any credit for it. I was purely the labourer on that day. My colleague designed it excellently and perfectly as well, so that everything was already pre-cut from the timber merchant. All we had to do was phone up and get them dropped off on site and not do any chopping ourselves. So it's got 4 bays and the boards that divide the bays in the middle. So essentially 2 boards can be taken out so that the compost can be shifted along like a conveyor belt, like a production line. We won't have a digger to turn this one. It will be done by hand. But there's nothing wrong with growing your muscles and turning over a bit of compost now and then. I'll put up a picture of that compost heap under construction. I'm doing this Facebook group that I think you can find if you search for the Garden Log podcast. Not the Facebook page, which is some sort of relic on there, but the Facebook group, the Garden Log podcast. It has 3 members at the moment. So if someone could join and make it a quartet, I would be very pleased. Then you can see the picture of the compost heap under construction. I have to say, as much as I love the herbaceous stuff, there is something to be said for a bit of heavy-duty construction. It's a relic. There is something that is there and will remain there, no matter what viral or bacterial diseases come over to the UK horticultural industry next. Wednesday was very cold. There was a heavy frost, which isn't really a heavy frost. Normally in January it would have been a frost, but because we've had so few of them recently, I'm calling it a heavy frost. It's not as good as one of the frosts that I had in the run-up to Christmas that I didn't tell you about because I was so lax with my podcasting at the end of last year. There was this wonderful day of frost just after a night of fairly heavy rain, and all of the leaves were still on the ground, and then they got flash frozen, so that when I blew them up the next day, each of them had collected this little crescent of ice in it, this little tiny boat-shaped crystal, and all of those blew out and chinked and chunked around as I blew up the leaves, and that was quite a magical. But this Wednesday it did not happen. I wandered around and cut back some grasses. The vogue, which I agree with, is for leaving things up, leaving all herbaceous material standing for as long as possible to provide interest for the eyes and habitats for the beasts and to provide more rest for the gardener. But some of the old grass was looking pretty bad, and this is miscanthus. And miscanthus, where it's grown in full sun, tends to stand up wonderfully, and will stand up, and I will only chop it back when we start seeing the new growth coming through the base of the clump. It stands up and it's got that brilliant tassel on the top of it. It looks quite military, I think. It's quite martial, the way it's so erect, and then it's got that almost brocade-like decoration on the top. But miscanthus grown more in the shade, as we've got some, tends to support itself less. We've got an area that's got a few grasses and phormiums and ceanothus, and then miscanthus has allowed itself to wiggle in between them, but it never really got enough sun, so now it's fallen over. Now it looks like there's just ropey old scarecrow hair lying around everywhere. So that was swept away and entidied, and the area does look a lot better. It's one of these things. There's no right or wrong, is there, anywhere? You can say, well, don't cut back until spring, but then you end up with a bloomin' eyesore. And you can say, well, chop everything down and make it neat, and then you've suddenly destroyed all the interest. So just use your common sense. You don't need to listen to anyone, to any podcasts. Just go out and do what you feel like. That's the lesson for Wednesday. On Thursday, we had more lessons, literal lessons. I was at my garden history masters, and we were discussing the gardens of Queen Anne, which was very exciting. Well, not just the gardens of Queen Anne, but the gardens in Queen Anne's reign, though we did actually talk about Queen Anne's gardens quite a bit. I think she had very good taste. I like the fact that she, at Hampton Court, got rid of all of that William III, William of Orange stuff, all of the incredibly ornate scroll works on the parterres, and she wasn't a fan of little fussy box hedges. She liked grass and gravel, and grass and gravel do look pretty good in front of a magnificent palace. So I think I'm a fan of hers, and that was quite fun as well because I went to see The Favourite, the film about her relationship with the two of the ladies of the bedchamber over Christmas, which is a brilliant film and also has some very good gardens in it. If you want to see great English gardens on film, I think most of it was filmed at Hatfield House, but there's also sections done at Hampton Court. I think I saw the fountain garden pop up a few times, so that's an actual Queen Anne garden in there. And Hatfield House has the most fantastic gardens anyway, and there's quite a few scenes where they ride out on horses through that magnificent wisteria arch, the wisteria grown over the arch that leads from one courtyard out, I think in the old Hatfield buildings, which is worth the admission price alone, as they say. And there's also some scenes where they set up a sort of shooting gallery on West Court or something, and then you see a few of the topiary works as they're out wandering around. It also features Sarah Churchill. She's one of the schemers, and she is the lady for whom well Blenheim Palace obviously was built for her and her husband, the Duke of Marlborough, but also Marlborough House down in London, which I think's got a really, really nice, very modern, early garden. It's just grass parterres and then the building. I'll put a picture of that up. So anyway, I remembered my time watching a good film over Christmas and had some gentle discussion of garden history as well. It was a good Thursday. On Friday, I was back in the gardens and back to horticulture. I went round checking on the Geranium madurense, because we had another few days of cold, and the Geranium madurense this year I think is going to be my obsession. You have strange things that preoccupy you more than they ought to, and for me this year it's getting the geraniums through the winter. And this isn't a horticultural necessity because I grew loads from seed, and there's loads and loads in the greenhouse ready to bring out and pot up and hopefully flower next year, so it doesn't matter if the ones in the garden do get knocked back by the frost. But now it's almost like a personal competition to see how far you can get. It's like when you're out running and it's, can I get to that lamppost before the cyclist crosses the pathway of that pram? A really strange and pointless goal, but somehow compelling nonetheless. These plants will be taking that role, I think, for the whole of the winter. I'll probably lose them frustratingly in the second week of March or something. I get these goals in the summer as well with growth. Can I get this plant to reach that? Will the rambling rector touch the top of the summer house? All of these silly things that you can go and check on, sometimes multiple times a day if you feel like really shirking. So I checked on the geraniums, and it was warm. It was very warm. I saw a bumblebee. It was floating about, bothering the heather. There's lots of heather around, and the bumblebee was very interested. It was a white-tailed bumblebee, if anyone is particularly interested, which I believe is one of the big seven species of abundant bumblebees. I wonder if I should actually make a competition with myself. When can you see all of the big seven bumblebees by? I'll let you know my result when I have collected them all. And that was it. That was Friday. I did do some more gardening, but it wasn't particularly memorable. It was of the wandering and thinking sort. I fussed around protecting some of the more tender outdoor plants, retying bits of string and stuffing in bits of hay that had escaped from bananas and tree fern protective sheaths. And that was it. That was the end of the week in gardening, the first week back. And it was a very good week indeed. I hope it was also good weeks for all of you. If it wasn't, then you can always write to me and maybe I can solve your problems. Someone has written to me, and now let's see if we can help them out. A horticultural conundrum this week from Coriander over in the States, who wrote me a lovely email full of very, very nice things she said about the podcast, which was very kind. And then she moved on to a horticultural conundrum, which I shall read for you now. Now, in complete honesty, I've been looking for a reason to email you about some horticultural conundrum or other, and I believe I have finally thought of a rather problematic plant I've had lately. Apologies to Coriander, by the way. I'm not doing an American accent because I can't. My mum bought a fern a couple of months ago, and it was fine for a long time. But of late, it has started to go all brown and crunchy, and I took it upon myself to read up on ferns and tend to it. But nothing I seem to do has really helped. And here we have a little sad face made from a colon and the opening of a bracket. Just to bring it home, it is sad. It is winter here where I live in the States, but I'm at my wit's end. I moved it out of the sun, I watered it frequently, spritzed it dutifully, I even placed a humidifier in the room, and it seemed to help a little. This plant, it just seems to hate me. And I really want that dark green colour I've seen in other ferns. I was hoping you'd possibly have some good tips or something that could help it. I think the heater in our house was getting to it, and I didn't have enough humidity from what I've read. Is there any suggestions you have for my poor fern? I think a greenhouse would help, but I don't have one. I appreciate any horticultural advice you can muster. Thank you so very much. A concerned fernist. I think that's a wonderful sign-off, by the way, Coriander, a concerned fernist. And I am concerned for you too. It sounds like a pretty common problem, and one that you have diagnosed yourself completely correctly. Over the last couple of months, we have slid into winter, and the houses have become sealed and heated, and as such have become dry and unconducive to fern health. The classic solution to fern problems is not to spritz or place a humidifier in, but is to place it in the bathroom, to put it next to the shower, into a place where the air is going to naturally be steamy and damp. If it's just going to be there for a few months, it really doesn't worry. It really doesn't need too much light. It could be put on the edge of a bath or a little shelf, somewhere around like that, and then you can sing to it while you're in the shower, which might help. Americans tend to have very big bathrooms. They're not like little English tiny tenement bathrooms where you have a bath and a shower and 4 square foot of room that gets completely full of steam. But if you do have a bathroom like that, then that would be somewhere to think about putting it. The other idea, I suppose, if you don't have a greenhouse, is to knock up some sort of terrarium job, an old fish tank. You could put that, not necessarily planted in it, but just put it over the top of it, like a bell jar, like a Wardian case, like something built by Dr. Nathaniel Bagshaw Ward to keep the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans out of plants being transported on ships. Something like that would probably help to keep the central heating away from your fern's fronds. The other thing you could do is to stand it in a tray of water. There's quite a few ways to do that. You could stand it in a tray of water with something in it, with gravel or rocks in it, so that it doesn't actually sit in the water. It sits just above them, and that might help keep the humidity up around it. And then you can just buy a load more ferns as well, and that might worry you slightly, because then you'll have so many more things to be concerned about killing. But lots of plants all smashed together, all transpiring in quite a small area. Go and find a small room and shove them all in there. And if they start to dry out, just buy more, and then eventually you'll create a little jungle with no radiators or heating vents, and in there both you and your plants should hopefully flourish. Sorry, I can't be more specific because there are so many different types of ferns out there, but they all suffer from central heating. But thank you very much for writing. And if anyone else would like to write in, then they can do so by writing to thegardenlogpodcast@gmail.com. In terms of horticultural recommendations for you this week, I don't really have any. I didn't do any horticultural reading over Christmas. I read novels, which is quite a nice break. But I did do some delving into the archive. I'm writing this project at the moment about a garden square in London, and I've been looking up various archival documents, letters written by Victorian gardeners, and I found this rather heartbreaking letter from a gardener who was wonderfully called Mr. Broom. There's something very, very moving about finding something in the archive that tells a story of a person's, of their relations with other persons, the story of one very, very misguided night. This is a letter I found from the 11th of June, 1864. And the nice thing about this is I'm probably one of the first people to have read this since poor old Broom, the gardener, penned it. It's dated June the 11th, 1864. Sir, I am truly sorry for my misconduct to you gentlemen last night. I drank too freely, and it flew to my head, and I did not know what I was about, for I'm sure I have no ill will to any gentleman in the square, for you all behave very well to me, and I must and will try to keep sober for the future. I trust you will forgive me this time, for I take it hard, after being 10 years in the square, to have to leave it. I trust you gentlemen that I offended will look over it this time, but I hope, if not, you will give me character so I can get a place. I remain your humble servant, M. Broom, 34 Kenton Street, Brunswick Square. So Mr. Broom must have had a few drinks and told the fussy men on the square's management committee what he really thought of them and their attitudes towards the cutting back of hellebores. I'm pleased to relate that the reply from the gentleman in question, the gentleman who had been abused by Mr. Broom, was one of forgiveness. They allowed him to keep his position, but told him if he were ever to repeat it, then he would be dismissed without references. Another drunken gardener gets to keep their job, which is a wonderfully positive note to end this week's podcast on. Thank you very much for listening all the way through 2018 and into 2019. I will be back in a week's time with more tales from the world of horticulture. I'm sure that the waving tide of spring excitement can only increase in next week's episode. So tune in and I'll speak to you all again then. Thank you. Goodbye.